The moment Victoria handed me that crystal bowl of fruit salad, I knew something was wrong. The sunroom gleamed with morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting rainbow patterns across the polished marble table. Fresh white orchids adorned every surface, and the smell of freshly baked croissants mingled with the aroma of Colombian coffee. It should have been perfect, this weekly Sunday brunch tradition that Victoria had insisted upon since Ryan and I married 2 years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But perfection, I'd learned, was Victoria's weapon of choice. She placed the bowl directly in front of me with that practiced smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her steel-gray eyes. "Claire, darling, I prepared this especially for you. I know how much you appreciate fresh ingredients." Her voice carried that honeyed tone she reserved for moments when she wanted to appear generous, but I caught the slight emphasis on the word especially. As a food blogger and former culinary school graduate, I'd developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to ingredients, flavors, and yes, when something had been tampered with. The fruit salad looked magnificent: strawberries glistening like rubies, chunks of golden pineapple, emerald kiwi slices arranged with artistic precision. But there was something in the syrup, something that made my stomach clench with unease. The Riverside Heights mansion had always felt more like a museum than a home to me. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every carefully placed decorative object served Victoria's vision of domestic perfection. She was a woman who controlled her environment with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, and today's brunch was no exception. Natalie sat across from me, already halfway through her own serving of fruit salad, completely oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that seemed to follow every interaction between Victoria and me. At 28, she was 3 years younger than me, but carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never questioned her place in the world. Golden-haired and effortlessly elegant, she was Victoria's pride and joy, the daughter who reflected everything Victoria valued about herself. Ryan sat beside me, absorbed in his phone as usual, occasionally glancing up to nod at his father Richard's commentary about the latest real estate market trends. My husband had inherited his mother's classic features, but none of her calculating nature. He was kind, dependable, and frustratingly naive about the complex dynamics that governed his family's interactions. Richard occupied his usual spot at the head of the glass table, reading sections of the financial news aloud while nursing his third cup of coffee. He was a man who had learned long ago to navigate around Victoria's moods rather than through them, and I often wondered what compromises he'd made over the years to maintain their seemingly harmonious marriage. I lifted the silver spoon Victoria had provided, studying the fruit salad more closely. The pieces looked fresh enough, but there was something about the glaze coating everything that triggered my professional instincts. As someone who had spent years perfecting recipes and developing an almost microscopic attention to flavor profiles, I knew when something was off. "Try it, dear," Victoria encouraged, settling into her chair with her own smaller portion. "I added a special honey reduction that I've been experimenting with. I thought someone with your culinary background would appreciate the complexity." The way she said culinary background carried just enough condescension to remind me that she'd never approved of my career choice. Victoria believed that women of a certain social standing should pursue hobbies, not professions, especially not ones that involved something as mundane as cooking for public consumption. I brought the spoon closer to my lips, but something made me hesitate. The honey reduction she mentioned had an almost medicinal undertone, barely detectable but unmistakably there. My mind raced through possibilities: bitter almond extract, used incorrectly perhaps, or something more sinister. Natalie looked up from her plate, wiping her mouth delicately with the linen napkin. "Mom, this is incredible. You really outdid yourself this time." She shot me a look that contained just a hint of superiority, the same expression she'd worn since I'd joined this family. "Claire, you're not eating. Don't tell me you're on another one of those food blogger diets." The comment stung because it was designed to. Natalie had a talent for making observations that sounded innocent, but carried sharp edges. She knew I'd struggled with maintaining my food blog while adjusting to the social expectations that came with marrying into the Morrison family. I forced a smile, still holding the spoon. Just savoring the presentation first. It's beautiful, Victoria. You always have such an eye for detail. The compliment was calculated, designed to buy me time while I figured out what to do next. Victoria's smile widened, but I noticed the way her fingers drummed silently against the table, a tell I'd observed during previous family gatherings when things weren't going according to her plan. She was waiting for something, watching me with the intensity of a hawk circling its prey. That's when inspiration struck. I shifted slightly in my chair, ostensibly to reach for my coffee cup, but in reality, I was positioning myself to execute a sleight of hand that would have made a professional magician proud. Years of cooking had given me dexterity with utensils and an awareness of spatial relationships that most people lack. "Oh, Natalie," I said, gesturing with my free hand while keeping the spoon steady in the other. "Did you see the article in Metropolitan Living about innovative brunch presentations? I bookmarked it thinking you might enjoy it for your Instagram." As Natalie's attention shifted toward me, leaning forward with interest, I made my move. With practiced ease, I slid my bowl slightly toward the center of the table while simultaneously pulling hers toward my place setting. The motion was fluid, natural, disguised as nothing more than enthusiastic gesturing about the magazine article. "Really? I haven't seen it yet," Natalie replied, completely unaware that our bowls had changed positions. "You know I'm always looking for fresh content ideas." Victoria had been watching our conversation with apparent disinterest, but I caught the moment her gaze flicked to the table, and her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She'd noticed something, but she couldn't be certain what had happened without making it obvious that she'd been monitoring my every movement. I picked up what was now Natalie's spoon and took a deliberate bite of the fruit salad that had originally been intended for her. The flavor was clean, sweet, with just the right balance of natural fruit sugars and a light citrus dressing. "Normal, safe, delicious," I said, meeting Victoria's eyes directly. "Your honey reduction really does add a wonderful depth of flavor." For just a moment, Victoria's mask slipped. I saw confusion flicker across her features, followed by something that looked dangerously close to frustration. She glanced at Natalie, who was now eating from what had originally been my serving, then back at me. "I'm so glad you're enjoying it," Victoria said, her voice steady but lacking its earlier warmth. "I was hoping it would be memorable." The choice of words sent a chill down my spine. Memorable, not delicious, not satisfying, but memorable. The kind of word you might use to describe an experience that leaves a lasting impact, good or bad. Ryan finally looked up from his phone, seemingly oblivious to the subtle war being waged across the brunch table. "Everything okay over here? You all seem a little tense." "Just discussing culinary techniques, honey," I replied smoothly. "Your mother was sharing some of her secret ingredients with me." Richard folded his newspaper and glanced around the table with the expression of a man who sensed undercurrents but preferred not to investigate them too closely. "Victoria, the fruit does taste different today. What did you add?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's fingers stopped their silent drumming, and she smiled with the kind of brightness that seemed almost aggressive. "Just a touch of lavender honey and some fresh thyme. I thought it would complement the strawberries." Lavender honey and thyme, both legitimate ingredients that could explain any unusual undertones I'd detected, but the explanation felt rehearsed, too perfectly delivered to be spontaneous. Natalie had finished about half of her fruit salad when she suddenly paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. She blinked several times as if trying to clear her vision, then set the utensil down carefully. "I think I need some water," she said quietly, her voice slightly strained. Victoria's attention snapped to her daughter immediately. "Are you feeling all right, sweetheart?" "I'm not sure," Natalie replied, pressing a hand to her forehead. "I just feel a little off. Maybe I'm coming down with something." I watched this exchange with growing certainty that my instincts had been correct. Something had been wrong with that fruit salad, something that was now affecting Natalie instead of me. The irony was almost too perfect. Victoria's golden child was experiencing whatever had been intended for the daughter-in-law she'd never fully accepted. "Perhaps you should lie down," Victoria suggested, but there was an undertone of panic in her voice that she was trying desperately to conceal. "You do look a bit pale." Natalie nodded, pushing her chair back from the table. "I think that's a good idea. I'm sorry to cut brunch short, but I really don't feel well. Ryan immediately stood to help his sister. Ever the protective older brother. Do you want me to drive you home, or we could call Dr. Patterson? No, no, Natalie waved him off, though I noticed her hand trembled slightly. I just need to rest. I'm probably just tired from working late this week, but as she stood to leave, I caught Victoria's expression when she thought no one was looking. It wasn't concern for her daughter's well-being. It was barely controlled fury at a plan gone wrong. After Natalie left, the atmosphere in the sunroom shifted dramatically. The easy facade of family harmony that Victoria worked so hard to maintain had cracked, and the tension underneath was becoming impossible to ignore. I should check on her, Victoria said, rising from her chair with movements that seemed just a little too controlled. I'm sure she'll be fine, I replied, taking another deliberate bite of my fruit salad. Sometimes our bodies react to things in unexpected ways. Victoria's eyes met mine across the table, and in that moment, I knew that the game was no longer hidden beneath layers of polite conversation and social niceties. We were acknowledging each other as adversaries, even if the men in our lives remained oblivious to the war that had just been declared. Yes, Victoria said slowly, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Sometimes they do. Richard cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the tension that had settled over the room like a fog. Perhaps we should all take a break. It's been a long morning. But I wasn't ready to retreat. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the opportunity to let Victoria know that her carefully constructed world of control and manipulation had met its match. Actually, I said, setting down my spoon and leaning back in my chair, I think this has been quite enlightening. It's amazing how much you can learn about people when you pay attention to the details. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Indeed, I've always believed that details are what separate the amateurs from the professionals. The challenge was unmistakable now. We were no longer pretending to be a happy family sharing a pleasant Sunday brunch. We were two women who understood that only one of us could control the narrative of this family's future. Ryan looked between us with growing confusion. Am I missing something here? You two are talking like you're in some kind of competition. Not competition, dear, Victoria replied, never taking her eyes off me. Just an appreciation for culinary craftsmanship. I smiled, matching her intensity. Absolutely. It's fascinating how the same ingredients can produce completely different results depending on the cook's intention. The double meaning wasn't lost on either of us. We were discussing much more than cooking techniques, and we both knew it. Richard folded his newspaper with more force than necessary. I think I'll go check on Natalie myself. This conversation seems to be heading in a direction that doesn't require my input. As he left the sunroom, Ryan remained seated, looking increasingly uncomfortable with the dynamic between his wife and his mother. He'd always been the type to avoid conflict, preferring to believe that any tension in his family was temporary and would resolve itself without his intervention. Mom, Claire, he said finally, whatever's going on between you two, can we please just talk about it like adults? This passive-aggressive thing is exhausting. Victoria and I exchanged another look, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for Ryan. He had no idea that his family's carefully maintained peace was built on a foundation of manipulation and control that his mother had spent decades perfecting. There's nothing passive about this conversation, I said quietly. Your mother and I are simply getting to know each other better. Victoria's laugh was musical but cold. Claire has such an interesting perspective on family dynamics. I'm curious to see how it develops over time. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria was letting me know that she had no intention of accepting defeat quietly. If I thought switching a bowl of fruit salad was enough to neutralize her, I was badly mistaken. But I'd learned something valuable in those few minutes. Something that changed everything. Victoria wasn't invincible. She could be surprised, outmaneuvered, and most importantly, she could make mistakes. The question now was whether I had the courage and intelligence to exploit those weaknesses before she regrouped and launched her next attack. As I sat in that beautiful sunroom, surrounded by orchids and morning light, I realized that my marriage to Ryan hadn't just made me part of the Morrison family, it had made me a player in a game I'd never known existed. With steaks I was only beginning to understand. The Sunday brunch tradition would continue. I was certain of that. Victoria would never abandon something that gave her such a perfect opportunity to maintain control over her family's interactions. But from now on, I would be watching, learning, and preparing for whatever she had planned next. Because if there was one thing I'd learned from my years in professional kitchens, it was that the best defense against a dangerous cook was to become an even better one yourself. The following Tuesday evening found me standing in the kitchen of our townhouse, methodically chopping vegetables for dinner while my mind replayed every detail of Sunday's brunch. Ryan was upstairs taking a shower after his evening jog, and the house was filled with the comfortable sounds of domestic routine. But beneath the normalcy, I felt like a soldier preparing for battle. My phone buzzed against the granite countertop. A text from Natalie, feeling much better today. Strange how sick I got on Sunday. Maybe I'm developing food allergies. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I stared at the message for a long moment, weighing my options. Natalie had always been cordial to me, but there was an underlying competitiveness that stemmed from her position as Victoria's favorite. She'd grown up believing she was the standard by which all other women in the family would be measured, and my presence had disrupted that comfortable dynamic. But now, for the first time, she was reaching out directly. The question was whether this was genuine concern about her health or something else entirely. I typed back carefully, "Coffee sounds perfect. The usual place at 10, her response came immediately, "See you there." As I sliced through a red bell pepper, I considered the implications. If Natalie was beginning to question what had happened to her on Sunday, it could be the opening I needed. Victoria's greatest strength had always been the unwavering loyalty of her children, but loyalty based on blind trust was fragile when that trust began to crack. Ryan appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair still damp from his shower, wearing the comfortable jeans and sweater that made him look more like the college professor he'd wanted to be rather than the real estate executive he'd become to please his family. "Smells amazing in here," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind and pressing a kiss to my neck. "What are we having?" "Stir fry with that ginger sauce you like," I replied, leaning back against his chest. For a moment I allowed myself to enjoy the simple pleasure of being held by my husband, the man who'd fallen in love with my passion for cooking, and had never tried to change me into someone else. "Mom called earlier," he said, and I felt my body tense despite my efforts to remain relaxed. "She wanted to make sure you weren't offended by Natalie getting sick during brunch. She's worried that you might think it reflected poorly on her hosting." I turned in his arms, studying his face. Ryan had inherited his father's tendency to accept Victoria's explanations at face value, but lately, I'd noticed small signs that he was beginning to question things he'd always taken for granted. "Did she seem upset about it?" I asked carefully. Ryan frowned slightly. "Actually, yeah, more than I would have expected. She kept asking if Natalie had mentioned feeling sick before she arrived, like she was trying to figure out exactly when it started." This was interesting. If Victoria was fishing for information about the timeline of Natalie's illness, it suggested she was trying to understand how her plan had gone wrong. The fact that she was worried enough to involve Ryan in the investigation meant she was more rattled than she'd appeared on Sunday. "Maybe she's just concerned about Natalie," I suggested, turning back to the stove. "Mothers worry." "Maybe," Ryan agreed, but there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "It's just, I don't know." She seemed almost frantic about it. "That's not like her." I stirred the vegetables in the pan, using the motion to hide my expression. "People react differently to unexpected situations. Even your mother can't control everything." Ryan was quiet for a moment, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him staring at nothing in particular, that expression he got when he was trying to work through a problem. "Claire," he said finally, "can I ask you something?" My heart rate quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "Of course. Do you think my family is normal?" The question caught me off guard. In all the time I'd known Ryan, he'd never directly questioned his family's dynamic. He'd always presented them as loving and close-knit, deflecting any observations I'd made about Victoria's controlling tendencies, or the way everyone seemed to walk on eggshells around her moods. I turned off the heat under the pan, and faced him fully. What do you mean by normal? He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his way of processing uncomfortable thoughts. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I was talking to Tom at work today about family dynamics, and he mentioned how his mother-in-law stays out of his marriage, lets him and his wife make their own decisions, and it got me thinking about how involved Mom is in Belle. This was the opening I'd been hoping for, but I knew I had to be careful. Push too hard, and Ryan would retreat back into denial. Be too subtle, and the moment would pass without any real progress. Every family has their own way of doing things, I said neutrally. What matters is whether everyone feels respected and heard. Ryan's laugh was bitter. Respected and heard. Right. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. When was the last time anyone in my family disagreed with my mother about something important? The question hung in the air between us, and I could see Ryan mentally cataloging years of interactions, looking for examples that suddenly weren't there. She means well, he said, but the words sounded automatic, like something he'd been telling himself for years without really examining whether he believed it. I moved closer to him, placing my hand on his arm. Ryan, can I tell you something without you getting defensive? He nodded, though I saw his jaw tighten slightly. I love you, and I love being part of your family, but sometimes I feel like there are conversations happening that I'm not part of. Decisions being made about our life that we never actually discussed. Ryan's frown deepened. Like what? I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. Like the way your mother always knows our schedule before we've told anyone. Or how she has opinions about my career that she shares with you but never directly with me. Or the way she arranges these family gatherings, and everyone goes along with whatever she wants. She's organized, Ryan said, but the defense lacked his usual conviction. She likes to plan ahead. There's a difference between being organized and needing to control every detail of other people's lives, I replied gently. Ryan was quiet for a long time, staring at the floor. When he finally looked up, there was something different in his expression, as if he was seeing familiar things from a new angle. Do you think she doesn't like you? He asked. The directness of the question surprised me. Do you? Another long pause. I think, he said slowly, that she's having trouble adjusting to the idea that I have a life that doesn't revolve around her approval. It wasn't a complete acknowledgement of Victoria's manipulative behavior, but it was more than Ryan had ever admitted before. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between the son who'd been trained never to question his mother, and the husband who was beginning to recognize that loyalty to family shouldn't require sacrificing his marriage. What do you want our life to look like? I asked. Not what your mother wants, not what you think you should want. What do you actually want? Ryan looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. I want to feel like we're making decisions together. I want to stop feeling like I have to choose between making you happy and making my family happy. You shouldn't have to choose, I said firmly. The fact that it feels like a choice is the problem. He nodded slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. What do we do about it? Before I could answer, my phone rang. Victoria's name appeared on the screen, and Ryan and I both stared at it as if it were a snake that had suddenly materialized on the counter. Speak of the devil, Ryan muttered. I looked at him questioningly, and he nodded. I answered the call, putting it on speaker. Claire, dear, I hope I'm not interrupting your dinner preparations. Victoria's voice filled the kitchen, smooth and pleasant as always. Not at all, I replied. What can I do for you? I wanted to follow up about Sunday. I've been so worried about Natalie's reaction to the fruit salad. I was wondering if you noticed anything unusual about it when you were eating. The question was carefully phrased, probing for information without revealing too much about her own concern. I glanced at Ryan, who was listening intently. It was delicious, I said truthfully. I didn't notice anything that would explain why Natalie got sick. Victoria mused. I've been racking my brain trying to figure out what could have caused such a reaction. The ingredients were all fresh. Nothing exotic or unusual. Sometimes these things just happen, I replied. Maybe she was already feeling under the weather and the rich food just pushed her over the edge. Perhaps. Victoria agreed, but I could hear the dissatisfaction in her voice. She wasn't getting the information she wanted. I was thinking about preparing something lighter for this Sunday. Maybe a simple green salad with a vinaigrette. The suggestion sent a chill down my spine. She was already planning the next gathering, the next opportunity to try again. That sounds lovely, I managed to say. Wonderful. I'll see you both on Sunday then. Give my love to Ryan. After I hung up, Ryan and I stared at each other in silence. That was weird, right? He said finally. The way she kept asking about the fruit salad. Very weird, I agree. Ryan shook his head. It's like she's conducting some kind of investigation. Who calls to ask detailed questions about food that made someone sick 3 days ago? Someone who's very concerned about what went wrong, I said carefully. Or someone who knows more about what went wrong than she's letting on, Ryan replied. And the words hung in the air like an accusation he wasn't quite ready to voice directly. I saw the exact moment when suspicion took root in Ryan's mind. His expression changed, became more guarded, and I knew he was starting to replay Sunday's events with new eyes. Claire, he said slowly, when Natalie got sick, you seemed, I don't know, not surprised. Exactly. But not shocked either. My heart pounded. But I kept my voice steady. I've seen food poisoning before. The symptoms weren't unusual. But you ate the same thing she did and you were fine. I didn't eat as much, I replied. Which was technically true. Ryan studied my face, and I could see him working through the logic, trying to understand how two people could eat the same dish and have completely different reactions. Unless, he said quietly, you didn't eat the same thing. The accusation hung between us, unspoken but understood. I had a choice to make. I could deny it, maintain the fiction that Sunday had been a series of unfortunate coincidences, or I could trust that the man I'd married was strong enough to handle the truth about his family. Ryan, I said carefully, if I told you something that would change how you see your mother, would you want to know? His face went pale. What are you saying? I'm asking if you're ready to hear things that might be difficult to accept. Ryan sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, running both hands through his hair. My mother wouldn't hurt anyone. She's controlling. Yes, but she's not. She wouldn't. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that was clearly forming in his mind. I sat down across from him, reaching for his hands. I switched our bowls, I said quietly. Ryan's head snapped up. What? During brunch, when Natalie and I were talking about that magazine article, I switched our fruit salad bowls. What she ate was originally meant for me. The color drained from Ryan's face completely. You think my mother tried to poison you? I think your mother put something in my food that she didn't expect me to notice. I don't know what it was, or what it was supposed to do. But yes, I think it was deliberate. Ryan stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. This is insane. You're talking about my mother, not some villain in a movie. I know how it sounds, I said gently. I know it's hard to believe. Hard to believe? Ryan's voice was rising. Claire, you're accusing my mother of attempted poisoning. That's not hard to believe. That's impossible to believe. But even as he said it, I could see the doubt creeping into his expression. He was remembering things. Victoria's obsessive need to control every detail. Her reaction when things didn't go according to plan. The way she'd questioned him about Natalie's illness. Why would she do something like that? He asked. But his voice was quieter now, less certain. Because she sees me as a threat to her control over this family. Because she's never accepted that you chose me over her vision of what your life should look like. Ryan sank back into his chair, staring at his hand. Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, but even if it were true, why would she risk hurting Natalie? Because she didn't expect the bowls to be switched. She was counting on me eating what she'd prepared and Natalie eating something safe. The logic was undeniable, and I watched Ryan work through it, saw the moment when the pieces clicked into place, and he realized that everything I was saying made a horrible kind of sense. Jesus, he whispered. What am I supposed to do with this? You don't have to do anything right now, I said, but I need you to know that this isn't over. She's already planning Sunday's brunch, already thinking about her next move. Ryan looked up at me, and I saw fear in his eyes for the first time since I'd known him. What are we going to do? The fact that he'd said we instead of you told me everything I needed to know. Whatever happened next, I wouldn't be facing Victoria alone. We're going to be very, very careful, I said, and we're going to make sure that next time, she's the one who gets surprised. The next morning, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a table near the window where I could watch for Natalie's arrival. The cafe was one of those carefully curated spaces that catered to Riverside Heights' affluent residents, with exposed brick walls, artisanal pastries, and coffee that cost more than most people spent on lunch. Natalie arrived precisely on time, looking polished and put together in a way that suggested she'd fully recovered from Sunday's illness. She wore a cream-colored blazer over dark jeans, her blonde hair styled in loose waves that caught the morning light. To anyone watching, we would have looked like two successful women meeting for a friendly catch-up. Claire, she said, sliding into the chair across from me with a smile that seemed genuine. Thanks for meeting me. I needed to get out of the office for a bit. I'd already ordered her usual a vanilla latte with an extra shot, and pushed it across the table as she settled in. How are you feeling? You had us all worried on Sunday. Natalie's expression shifted slightly, becoming more thoughtful. That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been thinking about what happened, and some things aren't adding up. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. What do you mean? Well, I felt perfectly fine when I arrived at Mom's house. I'd had a light breakfast, nothing unusual, and I was actually looking forward to her fruit salad, because she'd mentioned trying a new recipe. Natalie paused, stirring her latte absently, but then, about halfway through eating it, I started feeling strange. Not sick, exactly, but like my body was reacting to something it didn't recognize. I nodded encouragingly, waiting for her to continue. The thing is, Natalie went on, I've never had food allergies. I've eaten everything Mom has ever prepared without any problems. So why would I suddenly react to fruit salad? Sometimes allergies can develop later in life, I suggested, though I could see she wasn't buying the explanation. Maybe, she said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it. Or maybe there was something in the food that wasn't supposed to be there. The words hung between us, and I realized that Natalie was much closer to the truth than I'd expected. The question was whether she was ready to accept what that truth implied about her mother. What are you thinking? I asked carefully. Natalie was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee as if it might contain answers. I keep replaying that morning in my head, trying to remember exactly what happened and when. And there's something that's been bothering me. What's that? You barely touched your fruit salad at first. You kept hesitating, like you were reluctant to try it, and then suddenly, you were eating it normally, but I was the one getting sick. She looked up at me, her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. Don't you think that's strange? I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to make a leap that would change everything between us. Natalie was giving me an opening, but taking it meant trusting her with information that could either make her an ally or a dangerous enemy. Natalie, I said slowly, what would you do if you found out that someone you trusted had betrayed that trust? Her frown deepened. What kind of betrayal are we talking about? The kind that could hurt people you care about. Natalie set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. Claire, what exactly are you trying to tell me? I took a deep breath, making my decision. I think your mother put something in my fruit salad on Sunday, something that was supposed to make me sick instead of you. The words landed like a physical blow. Natalie's face went white, then flushed red, then white again. That's an incredibly serious accusation. I know it is. You're talking about my mother, the woman who raised me, who's never hurt anyone in her entire life. The woman who's spent years controlling every aspect of your family's lives, and sees me as a threat to that control, I countered gently. Natalie stood up abruptly, pacing to the window and back. Even if I believed you, which I'm not saying I do, why would she risk hurting me? I'm her daughter. Because she didn't expect the bowls to be switched. Natalie spun around to face me. Switched? What do you mean switched? I explained about the sleight of hand I'd performed while we were talking about the magazine article, watching Natalie's expression change as she processed the implications. So you're telling me, she said slowly, that you deliberately gave me food that you thought was poison. The accusation hit home, and I felt a stab of guilt. I'm telling you that I suspected something was wrong with my portion, and I acted on instinct to protect myself, by putting me in danger instead. I didn't know what was in it, I said defensively. I thought it might just be something to make me mildly sick, to embarrass me, or make me look weak. Natalie sat back down, her hands shaking slightly. This is insane. We're sitting here talking about my mother like she's some kind of criminal. I know how it sounds. Do you? Natalie's voice was rising, drawing glances from other patrons. Because it sounds like you're asking me to believe that everything I thought I knew about my family is a lie. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that your mother isn't the person you think she is. Natalie was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the tree-lined street. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. She's been different lately, she admitted. Since you and Ryan got married, more tense about family gatherings, more involved in Ryan's decisions. I thought she was just having trouble adjusting to having another woman in the family. What if it's more than that? Natalie turned to look at me, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes. What if you're wrong? What if this is all just a coincidence and you're asking me to destroy my relationship with my mother based on suspicion? And what if I'm right? I countered. What if she tries again? The question seemed to hit Natalie like a physical blow. She pressed her hands to her face, taking several deep breaths. I don't know what to do, she said finally. You don't have to do anything right now, I replied, echoing what I'd told Ryan the night before. But I need you to know that I'm not the enemy here. I love Ryan. I want to be part of this family, but not at the cost of pretending that dangerous behavior is normal. Natalie looked up at me, her makeup slightly smudged, but her expression more focused than it had been all morning. If what you're saying is true, if Mom really did try to hurt you, then she's going to try again. I nodded. Probably this Sunday. Then we need to be ready. The words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of a declaration of war. Natalie was choosing sides, and for the first time since I'd married into the Morrison family, I wasn't standing alone against Victoria's carefully constructed empire. What do you have in mind? I asked. Natalie's smile was sharp, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the steel beneath her polished exterior. If my mother wants to play games with food, then she's about to discover that she's not the only one in this family with secrets. The rest of the week passed in a strange suspension of normalcy. I continued my daily routines, updating my food blog, meeting with potential restaurant clients for consulting work, grocery shopping at the farmer's market, where vendors knew me by name. But underneath the familiar rhythms of my life, I felt like an actor playing a role, hyper-aware of every phone call from Victoria, every casual question from Ryan about our weekend plans. Thursday evening brought an unexpected development. Richard appeared at our front door, standing awkwardly on the porch, with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets. In all the time I'd known him, he'd never visited our townhouse alone. Richard, Ryan said, opening the door wider. This is a surprise. Come in. I hope I'm not intruding. Richard replied, stepping inside and nodding politely in my direction. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. It was a lie, and we all knew it. Richard never ventured into our part of town without a specific purpose, and he certainly didn't make casual social calls. Something had driven him here, something he couldn't or wouldn't discuss over the phone. "Can I get you something to drink?" I offered. "Coffee, or maybe something stronger." "Scotch would be good," he said, settling into one of our living room chairs with the careful movements of a man carrying a heavy burden. I poured 3 glasses of the expensive whiskey Ryan kept for special occasions, noting how Richard's hands weren't quite steady when he accepted his drink. Whatever had brought him here, it wasn't good news. "How's Victoria?" Ryan asked, settling onto the couch beside me. Richard took a long sip of his scotch before answering. "That's actually why I'm here. She's agitated about something." "More than usual." Ryan and I exchanged glances. "Agitated how?" "She's been asking questions. About Sunday's brunch. About Natalie's illness. About—" He paused, looking directly at me. "About you, Claire." A chill ran down my spine. "What kind of questions?" Richard seemed to age 10 years in the space of a few seconds. "She wants to know everything about your background, your family, your culinary training. She's been making calls, trying to dig up information about your past relationships, your financial situation before you married Ryan." "Why would she do that?" Ryan asked, though I could hear the strain in his voice. Richard finished his scotch and set the glass down with deliberate care. "Because she thinks you're hiding something. She's convinced that Sunday didn't go the way it was supposed to, and she's trying to figure out why." The words confirmed my worst fears. Victoria wasn't just planning her next move, she was conducting reconnaissance, trying to understand how I'd managed to outmaneuver her. "Dad," Ryan said slowly, "what exactly happened on Sunday? And don't tell me it was just bad food. Because we all know that's not the whole story." Richard looked between us, his expression tortured. For a moment, I thought he might deflect the question the way he'd spent years deflecting uncomfortable truths about his wife. But then something shifted in his demeanor, and I saw resignation replace evasion. "Your mother has always been particular about maintaining control over family dynamics," he said carefully. "Sometimes that means taking preemptive action when she perceives a threat." "Preemptive action," Ryan repeated flatly. "What does that mean?" Richard stood up abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the darkening street. "It means that your mother doesn't wait for problems to resolve themselves naturally. She intervenes. By poisoning people." The words burst out of Ryan before he could stop them. Richard's shoulders sagged. "I don't know the details of what she put in that fruit salad. I never know the details. But yes, she occasionally uses unconventional methods to address situations she finds problematic." The admission hung in the air like a confession. Ryan went pale, and I felt my own stomach clench with a mixture of vindication and horror. "How long has this been going on?" I asked quietly. Richard turned back to face us, and I saw decades of complicity etched in the lines around his eyes. "Since before you were born, Ryan. Your mother has very specific ideas about how our family should function, and she's willing to go to considerable lengths to ensure those ideas become reality." "You've known about this all along," Ryan said, his voice barely controlled. "You've known she was hurting people, and you never said anything." "I've known she was managing situations," Richard corrected, but the distinction felt hollow. "Your mother is brilliant, Ryan. Everything she does serves a purpose, and that purpose is usually protecting this family's interest. By making people sick." Ryan was on his feet now, pacing the length of our small living room. "By manipulating and controlling everyone around her. By ensuring that threats to our family's stability are neutralized before they can cause real damage," Richard replied, but his voice lacked conviction. I set down my untouched scotch and leaned forward. "Richard, what other threats has she neutralized over the years?" The question seemed to break something inside him. He sank back into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "Ryan's college girlfriend, the one who wanted him to move to California after graduation. She developed severe anxiety attacks whenever she was around the family, eventually broke up with him, because she said being near us made her physically ill. Ryan stopped pacing. Amanda? You're saying Mom did something to Amanda? I'm saying Amanda suddenly started having panic attacks and digestive issues that only seemed to occur during family gatherings, Richard replied. The symptoms were consistent with certain pharmaceutical interventions. The euphemism was almost worse than a direct admission. I felt sick thinking about some young woman being systematically poisoned because Victoria disapproved of her relationship with Ryan. Who else? I asked. Richard closed his eyes. Natalie's first serious boyfriend, the one who proposed to her when she was 20. He had grand mal seizures at our anniversary dinner. The doctors never could figure out what caused them, but he was too frightened to continue the relationship. Jesus Christ, Ryan whispered. The business partner who tried to convince me to sell my share of the real estate company to a competitor. He developed what appeared to be early onset dementia, couldn't remember conversations from one day to the next, eventually had to step down from active management. Each revelation was like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just been controlling her immediate family, she'd been systematically eliminating anyone who threatened her vision of how their lives should unfold. How is this possible? Ryan demanded. How has she been getting away with this for decades? Richard opened his eyes, meeting his son's gaze directly. Because she's careful, because the symptoms she creates are always plausibly medical, and because she chooses her targets wisely, people who don't have the resources or connections to fight back. And you've been helping her, I said quietly. I've been protecting our family, Richard replied, but the words sounded rehearsed, like something he'd been telling himself for years. By enabling a woman who poisons people who inconvenience her, Ryan shot back. By ensuring that our family's wealth and reputation remain intact, Richard countered. Do you have any idea what would happen if Victoria's activities came to light? The scandal would destroy everything we've built. Maybe it should be destroyed, Ryan said quietly. The words seemed to shock Richard more than anything else that had been said. He stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time. Ryan, you don't understand the full scope of what's at stake here. Your mother has files, documentation of every intervention she's ever made. If she goes down, she'll take half of Riverside Heights with her. What kind of documentation? I asked. Richard hesitated, then seemed to realize there was no point in holding back now. Financial records, medical reports, correspondence with certain physicians who've been cooperative over the years. She's built an entire network of people who owe her favors or fear her exposure. She's been blackmailing people, Ryan said flat. She's been cultivating useful relationships, Richard corrected, but even he seemed to recognize how weak the distinction sounded. I thought about the phone call Victoria had made to me earlier in the week, her probing questions about Sunday's brunch. She wasn't just planning her next attack on me, she was also calculating the potential collateral damage if her activities were exposed. Richard, I said carefully, why are you telling us this now? He looked at me with something that might have been because I think you're going to survive this, and I want to be on the winning side when the dust settles. The admission was both honest and chilling. Richard wasn't warning us out of moral conviction, he was hedging his bets, ensuring that his own complicity wouldn't destroy him if Victoria's empire finally crumbled. What does she have planned for Sunday? Ryan asked. I don't know the specifics, Richard replied, but she's been researching natural toxins, things that would be difficult to detect in a standard autopsy. She's also been asking questions about your insurance policies. Claire, the words hit me like ice water. Victoria wasn't just planning to make me sick, she was planning to kill me. Ryan must have reached the same conclusion because he went completely still, his face draining of color. She's going to try to murder my wife. She's going to try to solve what she sees as a problem, Richard said quietly. The fact that you might die in the process is regrettable but acceptable collateral damage. Get out, Ryan said suddenly. Richard blinked. What? Get out of my house. Right now. Ryan, I'm trying to help you understand. You're trying to save your own skin, Ryan interrupted, his voice rising. You've spent decades enabling a woman who poisons people, and now that it's finally catching up with you, you want to make a deal. Richard stood slowly, adjusting his coat. You're making a mistake, son. Victoria is not someone you want as an enemy. She became my enemy the moment she tried to hurt my wife, Ryan replied coldly. After Richard left, Ryan and I sat in stunned silence for a long time. The magnitude of what we'd learned was overwhelming, not just the immediate threat to my safety, but the realization that Victoria had been operating as a sort of domestic terrorist for decades. We have to go to the police, Ryan said finally. I shook my head. With what evidence? Richard's testimony. He's been complicit in everything she's done, and you heard him. She's built a network of people who will protect her. Then what do we do? I thought about Natalie's words at the coffee shop, her promise that we would be ready for Victoria's next move. We beat her at her own game. Ryan turned to look at me, and I saw fear and determination warring in his expression. How? By making sure that when she makes her move on Sunday, she's the one who ends up exposed. The plan we developed over the next 2 days was risky, requiring precise timing and a level of deception that felt foreign to both Ryan and me, but Victoria had spent years perfecting her methods, learning from each intervention to make the next one more effective. If we were going to stop her, we needed to be just as calculating. Friday afternoon, I called Victoria to confirm our attendance at Sunday's brunch. Claire, dear, she said, her voice warm with false affection, I was just thinking about you. I've planned something special for this week, a lovely green salad with herbs from my garden. That sounds wonderful, I replied, injecting enthusiasm into my voice. I've been looking forward to it all week. Have you? There was something sharp beneath the pleasantness now. How delightful. I do hope this week goes more smoothly than last Sunday. I'm sure it will, I said. After all, what could possibly go wrong? The question hung in the air for a moment longer than was comfortable, and I could almost hear Victoria recalculating, trying to determine whether my words carried a hidden meaning. Indeed, she said finally, what could go wrong? After I hung up, I found myself thinking about all the people Victoria had hurt over the years, all the lives she'd disrupted because they didn't fit into her carefully controlled narrative. Amanda, the college girlfriend who'd developed anxiety attacks, Natalie's boyfriend who'd had seizures, the business partner who'd lost his memory, and countless others we probably didn't even know about. Victoria had operated with impunity for decades, because she'd chosen her victims carefully, targeting people who were isolated, who wouldn't be believed, who couldn't fight back effectively. But she'd made a crucial error in targeting me. Unlike her previous victims, I wasn't alone. I had Ryan, who was finally seeing his mother clearly. I had Natalie, who was angry enough about being poisoned to want revenge. And I had skills that Victoria had underestimated, professional knowledge about food and cooking that gave me advantages she hadn't anticipated. Saturday evening, Natalie came to our townhouse for what we'd told Victoria was a casual dinner between the siblings. In reality, it was our final planning session. I still can't believe we're doing this, she said, accepting a glass of wine from Ryan. 6 months ago, if someone had told me I'd be plotting against my own mother, I would have had them committed. 6 months ago, I would have agreed with you. Ryan replied, but that was before I understood what she really is. Natalie had spent the week doing her own investigation into Victoria's activities, using her access to the family's financial records and her position at the real estate company to trace patterns of unusual expenditures and suspicious timing. I found payments to 3 different physicians over the past 10 years, she reported. Always in cash, always for consulting fees that don't correspond to any legitimate medical services provided to our family. What kind of physicians? I asked. A neurologist, a gastroenterologist, and a toxicologist. Natalie replied grimly. The perfect combination for someone who wants to create symptoms that look like natural medical episodes. The evidence was damning, but it was also circumstantial. Victoria had been careful to maintain plausible deniability, ensuring that any investigation would struggle to prove intentional harm. What about tomorrow? Ryan asked. Are you sure you're ready for this? Natalie's expression hardened. She poisoned me, Ryan. She put something in my food that made me sick, and she did it without caring about the consequences. I'm more than ready. We reviewed the plan one more time, checking every detail, anticipating potential complications. Victoria was brilliant and experienced, but she was also overconfident. She'd been playing this game for so long that she'd forgotten it was possible to lose. Whatever happens tomorrow, I said as Natalie prepared to leave, there's no going back after this. Once we expose her, everything changes. Natalie nodded grimly. Good. It's time for things to change. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that made Victoria's garden look like something from a magazine spread. As Ryan and I walked up the curved driveway to the mansion, I carried a small overnight bag that contained everything we'd need for the afternoon's confrontation. Victoria greeted us at the door with her usual perfect smile, wearing a flowing lavender dress that made her look like an elegant hostess from a bygone era. Ryan, Claire, how wonderful to see you. I've prepared something very special for today. We can't wait, I replied, matching her enthusiasm. The sunroom had been set even more elaborately than usual, with crystal bowls filled with fresh flowers and place settings that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Victoria had clearly decided to make this brunch memorable, though not for the reasons her guests might expect. "Where's Dad?" Ryan asked, looking around the empty room. "Oh. He had to run an errand," Victoria replied smoothly. "He'll be back later." Sometimes it's nice to have a more intimate gathering, don't you think? The absence of Richard wasn't a surprise. We'd expected Victoria to want fewer witnesses for whatever she had planned. What did surprise me was how calm she seemed, how confident in her ultimate success. Natalie arrived exactly on time, looking beautiful and composed in a way that gave no hint of the storm brewing beneath her polished exterior. She kissed her mother's cheek and complimented the table setting, playing her role perfectly. "Now then," Victoria said once we were all seated, "I hope everyone's hungry. I've prepared individual salads today, each one tailored to your specific taste." She presented each of us with a crystal bowl containing what appeared to be identical green salads, but I noticed the subtle differences in garnish that suggested she'd indeed prepared them separately. My bowl contained additional herbs and what looked like edible flowers, making it both more beautiful and more dangerous than the others. "This looks amazing, Mom," Natalie said admiringly. "You really outdid yourself." Victoria beamed with pride, clearly pleased with the praise. I wanted today to be special. After all, it's not every day that a family comes together to celebrate their bonds. The word celebrate felt ominous, loaded with meaning that only Victoria fully understood. I picked up my fork, aware that everyone was watching me, waiting to see what would happen next. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of weeks of suspicion and days of careful planning. Victoria had spent years perfecting her methods, but she'd never faced an opponent who understood both her tactics and her psychology. As I lifted the first bite toward my lips, I saw Victoria's eyes gleaming with anticipation, and I knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just my fate, but the future of the entire Morrison family. The fork felt impossibly heavy in my hand as I brought it toward my mouth. Every second stretched into an eternity of anticipation. Victoria's eyes tracked my movement with laser focus, her breathing shallow with excitement. She thought she was watching the beginning of my end, the moment when her carefully crafted plan would finally eliminate the threat I represented to her perfect world. Instead, she was about to witness her own downfall. I took the bite, chewing slowly and deliberately while maintaining eye contact with Victoria. The salad tasted exactly as I'd expected it to: crisp lettuce, fresh herbs, and underneath it all, the subtle bitter undertone that my trained palate recognized immediately. Oleander extract, if I had to guess, mixed with something else that created a delayed reaction. Clever and nearly undetectable, the kind of sophisticated poisoning that would appear to be a tragic accident. "Delicious," I said, swallowing the bite and reaching for my water glass. "You really have outdone yourself, Victoria." Her smile widened with satisfaction, but I caught the way her fingers drummed silently against the table, counting down the minutes, until the toxin would begin to take effect. She was expecting symptoms to manifest within 15 to 20 minutes, probably starting with dizziness and nausea before progressing to more serious complications. What Victoria didn't know was that I'd taken activated charcoal tablets before arriving, along with other precautionary measures that my research into antidotes had suggested. More importantly, she didn't know that we'd anticipated this exact scenario and prepared accordingly. Ryan and Natalie continued eating their own salads, keeping up casual conversation about work and weekend plans, while we all waited for Victoria's plan to unfold. The atmosphere felt surreal, like actors performing a play where only some of the cast knew the real script. "Claire," Victoria said after about 10 minutes had passed, "you seem to be eating more slowly than usual. Are you feeling all right?" It was the helpful concern, the careful monitoring of my condition, the gradual shift from hostess to caregiver that would allow her to control the narrative when I inevitably started showing symptoms. "I'm fine," I replied, taking another deliberate bite, just savoring the flavor. "This dressing is particularly complex." Victoria's eyes flickered with something that might have been impatience. "I'm glad you appreciate it. I spent considerable time perfecting the recipe." 15 minutes passed, then 20. I continued eating steadily, showing no signs of the distress Victoria was clearly expecting. Her drumming fingers grew more agitated, and I noticed a thin sheen of perspiration beginning to form along her hairline despite the cool temperature in the sunroom. "Mom," Natalie said suddenly, "you're not eating much. Is everything okay?" Victoria startled slightly, as if she'd forgotten anyone else was at the table. "Oh, I'm fine, darling. I suppose I'm just not as hungry as I thought." But her attention remained fixed on me, studying my face for any hint of the symptoms she'd engineered. When 25 minutes had passed without any visible effect, Victoria's composure began to crack. "Claire," she said, her voice carrying a note of forced casualness, "how are you feeling? You look a bit flushed." I touched my cheek with mock concern. "Do I? I feel perfectly normal. Perhaps it's just the sunlight from the windows." Ryan and Natalie exchanged subtle glances, both of them recognizing the increasing tension in Victoria's demeanor. She was realizing that something had gone wrong, that her carefully calculated plan wasn't producing the expected results. "Maybe you should drink some water," Victoria suggested, her helpful tone edged with desperation. "Sometimes dehydration can cause unexpected reactions." "Good idea," I agreed, draining my water glass and reaching for the pitcher to refill it. "Though I have to say, I'm feeling quite energetic today. Must be all these wonderful fresh herbs." Victoria's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She'd been counting on my collapse by now, expecting to be calling an ambulance and playing the role of concerned mother-in-law devastated by another tragic accident at her dinner table. That's when I decided it was time to turn the tables complete. "Victoria," I said, setting down my water glass with deliberate care, "I have to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." Her entire body went rigid. "Of course, dear. What is it? Do you really think I'm that naive?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Victoria's practiced smile faltered, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely uncertain. "I'm sorry, I don't understand what you mean." I leaned back in my chair, studying her with the same intensity she'd been directing at me. "I mean, do you really think I wouldn't notice when someone puts oleander extract in my food?" The color drained from Victoria's face so quickly that she looked like she might faint. Ryan and Natalie both tensed, though they were prepared for this moment. They were still shocked to hear the accusation stated so directly. "That's a very serious accusation," Victoria said, her voice barely steady. "It's a very serious crime," I replied calmly. "Attempted murder, to be specific." Victoria's gaze darted around the table, looking for escape routes or allies but finding neither. Ryan was staring at her with a mixture of horror and disgust, while Natalie's expression had hardened into something I'd never seen before, pure fury. "I don't know what you think you're implying," Victoria said, but her voice lacked its usual authority. I reached into the overnight bag I'd brought and pulled out a small device that looked like a digital thermometer. "This is a portable spectrometer," I explained, holding it up for her to see. "It can detect trace amounts of various compounds in food and liquid." Victoria's eyes widened as she recognized the implications. "I tested my salad before I ate it," I continued, Would you like to know what I found? This is ridiculous, Victoria said. But she was backing away from the table, her chair scraping against the floor. You're being paranoid and dramatic. Am I? I touched the device to the remains of my salad and watched as numbers appeared on its small screen. Oleander glycosides, present in concentrations that would be lethal within 30 minutes of consumption. Also traces of ricin, probably from castor beans, and something else I can't quite identify but suspect is meant to accelerate the absorption rate. The technical details seemed to hit Victoria like physical blows. She'd been caught not just in the act, but with scientific evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. You're insane, she whispered. But the words carried no conviction. Actually, Natalie said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began, she's brilliant. Unlike your other victims, Mom. Claire actually fought back. Victoria spun to face her daughter, desperation replacing calculation in her expression. Natalie, darling, you can't possibly believe this nonsense. Claire is obviously disturbed, probably jealous of our family's closeness. Our family's closeness, Natalie repeated flatly. Is that what you call poisoning anyone who threatens your control? Because I've done some research this week, Mom. I know about Amanda, about my ex-boyfriend Marcus, about Dad's business partner. I know about all of them. Victoria's face cycled through several expressions: shock, denial, rage, and finally a cold fury that was more frightening than anything I'd seen from her before. You ungrateful little bitch, she hissed, her mask of maternal warmth dropping completely. After everything I've done for this family, everything I've sacrificed to keep us together and successful, this is how you repay me. The transformation was stunning. Gone was the elegant hostess, the loving mother, the sophisticated matriarch. In her place stood a woman consumed by the need to control, willing to destroy anyone who dared to challenge her authority. Everything you've sacrificed. Ryan stood up slowly, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. Mom, you've been poisoning people for decades. You tried to murder my wife. I was protecting our family, Victoria snapped. Claire was going to ruin everything. Change Ryan. Make him weak and dependent. Someone had to take action. By killing her, Ryan's voice cracked with emotion. By solving the problem before it destroyed what I'd spent years building, Victoria replied coldly. You were happy before she came along, Ryan. We all were. This family worked perfectly until she arrived with her ambitions and her need to change everything. I watched this exchange with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. Victoria genuinely believed she was justified, that her actions were noble sacrifices for the greater good of her family's harmony. In her mind, she wasn't a serial poisoner. She was a protector, eliminating threats to her loved one's happiness. What about Natalie? I asked quietly. When you poisoned her last week, was that protecting the family too? Victoria's gaze snapped to me, and I saw something flicker across her expression that might have been regret. That was an accident. Natalie wasn't supposed to eat that serving, but you let her suffer anyway, Natalie said, her voice deadly quiet. You watched me get sick, watched me vomit and shake and feel like I was dying, and you said nothing. You even suggested it might be an allergy. I couldn't explain without exposing the larger plan, Victoria said, as if this were a reasonable justification. Sometimes there's collateral damage in any worthwhile endeavor. The phrase collateral damage, applied to her own daughter, seemed to break something in Natalie. She stood up abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash. You're a monster, she said simply. I don't know how I never saw it before, but you're an absolute monster. Victoria's expression crumpled, and for a moment she looked like a lost child rather than a calculating predator. Natalie, please, you don't understand the pressures I've been under, the constant threats to our family's stability. Everything I did was for you, for Ryan, for all of us. Everything you did was for control. I correct. You couldn't stand the idea that people might make choices you didn't approve of, so you eliminated their ability to choose. Victoria turned back to me, and I saw her expression shift once again, this time settling into something that looked almost like admiration. You know, she said thoughtfully, if circumstances were different, I think I might actually like you. You're intelligent, resourceful, and you understand the importance of strategic thinking. In another situation, you might have been a valuable ally, but instead, you tried to kill me. Instead, I recognized you as a threat that needed to be neutralized. Victoria straightened her shoulders, regaining some of her composure. The question now is what happens next. It was Ryan who answered. What happens next is that we call the police, and you face the consequences of what you've done. Victoria laughed, a sound devoid of humor. The police, and tell them what? That you have circumstantial evidence suggesting I put something in food that you ate without any apparent ill effect, that you used some device you bought online to test for compounds that you have no legal authority to investigate. She was right, and we all knew it. The evidence we'd gathered was compelling but circumstantial. Victoria had been careful over the years to build plausible deniability into her actions, and she had decades of experience in covering her tracks. Besides, Victoria continued, her confidence returning, you're forgetting about the insurance policies. My blood ran cold. What insurance policies? Victoria's smile was sharp as a blade. The ones I took out on you 6 months ago, naming myself as beneficiary. The ones that would pay out handsomely in the event of your accidental death, especially if that death occurred due to an undiagnosed medical condition that manifested suddenly during a family gathering. The implication was crystal clear. Even if we couldn't prove her guilt in court, Victoria had created a paper trail that would make my death financially beneficial to her. Any investigation would have to consider the possibility that she'd murdered me for money, and that kind of motive was much easier for prosecutors to understand than complex family power dynamics. You're insane, Ryan said flatly. I'm thorough, Victoria corrected. And I'm not finished yet. That's when I realized we'd made a crucial error in our planning. We'd assumed that exposing Victoria would be enough to stop her, that confronting her with evidence of her crimes would somehow neutralize the threat she represented. But Victoria wasn't the type of person who accepted defeat gracefully. She reached into her purse, which had been sitting on a side table throughout the meal, and pulled out a small spray bottle filled with clear liquid. Hydrogen cyanide gas, she said conversationally, as if discussing the weather, completely undetectable once it dissipates, causes symptoms that mimic heart attack or stroke. I was saving this as a backup plan, but it seems circumstances have forced my hand. Ryan and Natalie both froze, but I was already moving. Years of working in professional kitchens had taught me to react quickly to dangerous situations, and I recognized the immediate threat the spray bottle represented. I lunged forward, grabbing Victoria's wrist before she could activate the device. She was stronger than I'd expected, her desperation giving her additional strength, but I had youth and determination on my side. Ryan, I shouted as Victoria and I struggled for control of the bottle. Calm now. But even as we fought, I could see Victoria calculating, looking for another angle of attack. She might lose this battle, but she wasn't going to surrender without inflicting as much damage as possible. The spray bottle flew from her hand as we grappled, landing with a crack against the marble floor. The sound of breaking glass filled the sunroom, followed immediately by the acrid smell of chemicals mixing with the morning air. Everyone out! I yelled, grabbing Ryan's arm and pulling him toward the door. The fumes could be toxic. We stumbled from the sunroom in a confused tangle of limbs and panic, but even as we reached the safety of the main house, I knew our confrontation with Victoria was far from over. She'd shown us exactly how far she was willing to go to maintain control, and that knowledge changed everything. As sirens began to wail in the distance, I realized that we'd won this battle, but the war was just beginning. Victoria Morrison had been exposed, but she was also cornered, and cornered predators were the most dangerous kind. The next few hours passed in a blur of police officers, paramedics, and crime scene technicians. Victoria had been taken into custody, though she maintained her innocence with the same cool composure she'd displayed throughout our confrontation. The broken spray bottle was carefully collected as evidence, along with samples of the poison salad and the spectrometer readings I'd recorded. Detective Sarah Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who seemed entirely unfazed by the bizarre nature of our case, interviewed each of us separately. When it was my turn, she studied me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. "This is an unusual situation," she said, settling back in her chair. "Most poisoning cases we see are crimes of passion, spur-of-the-moment decisions made in anger or desperation. What you're describing sounds more like the work of a serial killer." "That's because it is," I replied. "Victoria Morrison has been systematically poisoning people for decades. We're just the first ones to fight back effectively." Detective Walsh made notes in her pad, occasionally looking up to study my expression. "The evidence you've provided is compelling, but building a prosecutable case is going to be challenging. Miss Morrison has no prior criminal record, an impeccable reputation in the community, and considerable financial resources to mount a defense. What about the insurance policies? Suspicious but not necessarily illegal. People take out life insurance policies on family members all the time." I felt a familiar frustration building. Victoria had been too careful to be brought down by a single incident, no matter how dramatic. However, Detective Walsh continued, "Your spectrometer readings combined with the chemical residue from the spray bottle give us enough probable cause to search the Morrison residence. If Morrison has been doing this for as long as you suspect, there's a good chance we'll find additional evidence." The search of Victoria's house took place the following day, conducted by a team of forensic specialists who seemed both fascinated and appalled by what they discovered. Hidden in a locked cabinet in Victoria's home office, they found an extensive collection of books on toxicology, detailed records of her victims' symptoms and recovery times, and most damning of all, a private journal documenting her activities over the past 15 years. The journal entries were written in Victoria's careful handwriting, describing each poisoning incident with clinical detachment. She'd recorded dosages, reaction times, and effectiveness ratings as if she were conducting scientific experiments, rather than attempting murder. The entry about me was particularly chilling. Subject exhibits unusual resistance to standard botanical toxins, increased dosage and combination therapy required. Consider more aggressive intervention if initial treatment proves insufficient. Note: subject's culinary background may contribute to heightened awareness of adulterants. Recommend caution in preparation and presentation. Reading those words, seeing myself reduced to a laboratory subject in Victoria's twisted experiments, drove home the reality of what I'd escaped. She hadn't just been trying to remove me from Ryan's life, she'd been studying me, learning my patterns and preferences to make her attack more effective. Other entries detailed her previous victims with the same cold precision. Amanda, Ryan's college girlfriend, had been administered a combination of anxiety-inducing compounds that created panic attacks whenever she was around the family. Marcus, Natalie's ex-boyfriend, had been given a seizure-inducing drug that mimicked epilepsy. The business partner had received memory-affecting medications that created symptoms resembling dementia. Each entry included follow-up notes about the victim's long-term outcomes, as if Victoria had been conducting a longitudinal study on the effectiveness of her method. Some victims had never fully recovered from their experiences, living with ongoing health issues they'd never been able to explain. The most disturbing discovery was a second journal labeled Future Consideration. This one contained detailed profiles of potential future threats to the family's stability, complete with preliminary research into their vulnerabilities and suggested intervention strategy. Ryan's name appeared multiple times, with notes about his growing independence and his need to be realigned with family priorities. Natalie was listed as generally compliant but requires occasional reinforcement. Even Richard had an entry, describing him as useful but potentially unreliable under pressure. Victoria had been planning to systematically drug and control every member of her own family to ensure their continued obedience. She hadn't just been eliminating external threats, she'd been preparing to turn her children and husband into permanent prisoners of her will. The evidence was overwhelming, but Victoria's response to her arrest was perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire ordeal. She showed no remorse, no recognition that her actions had been wrong. Even when confronted with her own journals, she maintained that everything she'd done had been necessary to protect her family's interests. "You don't understand the pressures of maintaining a family's reputation and success," she told Detective Walsh during her interrogation. Sometimes difficult decisions have to be made for the greater good. I was the only one strong enough to make those decisions. When asked about the insurance policies on my life, she was equally unrepentant. Claire was going to destroy everything we'd built. Her death would have been unfortunate, but the financial compensation would have helped Ryan move on with his life more quickly. The clinical way she discussed my planned murder, as if it were simply another item on her to-do list, demonstrated a level of psychological detachment that even the experienced detectives found disturbing. Victoria Morrison was ultimately charged with 17 counts of attempted murder, spanning incidents over the past 20 years. Additional charges included fraud, conspiracy, and unlawful imprisonment based on her systematic drugging of family members. Her network of corrupt medical professionals was also investigated, leading to additional arrests and the revocation of several medical licenses. The trial became a sensation, drawing national media attention as the full scope of Victoria's activities was revealed. Expert witnesses testified about the sophisticated nature of her poisoning methods, the psychological profile of someone capable of such calculated cruelty, and the long-term effects on her victim. Many of those victims came forward during the trial, finally understanding what had happened to them years earlier. Amanda testified about the panic attacks that had destroyed her relationship with Ryan and continued to affect her for years afterward. Marcus described the seizures that had ended his engagement to Natalie and left him with ongoing neurological issues. The business partner, now in his 70s, spoke about the memory problems that had forced him into early retirement and strained his relationships with his own family. Their testimonies painted a picture of Victoria as a predator who had destroyed lives without a second thought, leaving a trail of broken people in her wake. The cumulative weight of their stories was devastating, making it impossible for even Victoria's expensive legal team to mount an effective defense. Throughout the trial, Victoria maintained her composure, sitting in the defendant's chair with the same regal bearing she'd displayed at family gatherings. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the prosecution's portrayal of her actions as criminal, as if she couldn't understand why protecting her family's interests was being treated as a bad thing. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria Morrison was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that reflected both the severity of her crimes and the likelihood that she would continue to be dangerous if ever released. As the judge read the sentence, Victoria's mask finally slipped completely. The elegant matriarch disappeared, replaced by a woman consumed with rage at a world that refused to recognize her authority. She screamed curses at the prosecution, at the victims who had testified against her, and most vitally at her own children for their betrayal of everything she'd tried to build. "You've destroyed our family," she shouted as the bailiffs restrained her. "Everything I did was for you, and this is how you repay me. You'll regret this for the rest of your lives." Even in defeat, Victoria couldn't accept responsibility for her action. In her mind, she remained the victim, wrongfully persecuted for making the difficult decisions that family leadership required. 6 months after Victoria's sentencing, I stood in the kitchen of our new home, a charming craftsman-style house on the other side of town, far from the shadow of the Morrison mansion. Sunlight streamed through the windows as I prepared ingredients for my latest blog post, a series on comfort foods that heal both body and soul. The irony wasn't lost on me that after surviving a systematic poisoning campaign, I'd found peace through cooking again. The sound of keys in the front door announced Ryan's return from work. His real estate firm had distanced itself from the Morrison name after the trial, but Ryan had surprised everyone by thriving in the aftermath of his mother's exposure. Without the constant pressure to meet Victoria's expectations, he'd discovered a confidence and independence that had been buried for years. "How did the therapy session go?" I asked as he wrapped his arms around me from behind, a ritual that had become precious to both of us. "Better than expected," he replied, pressing a kiss to my temple. "Dr. Martinez thinks I'm making real progress with the guilt issues." The guilt had been the hardest part for Ryan to overcome. Despite understanding that Victoria's actions weren't his fault, he'd struggled with the knowledge that he'd been blind to her crimes for so long. The fact that she'd planned to eventually drug him into compliance only made the betrayal more painful. "Natalie called earlier," I said, leaning back against his chest. She wanted to invite us to dinner this weekend to meet her new boyfriend, Ryan chuckled, and I felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Let me guess. She's already running background checks on the poor guy. Actually, no. She said she's trying to trust her own judgment more these days. The transformation in Natalie had been remarkable. Learning that her mother had poisoned her own daughter had shattered the foundation of everything she'd believed about family loyalty. But rather than breaking her, the revelation had freed her to become the person she'd always been underneath Victoria's controlling influence. She'd left the family real estate business to start her own marketing consultancy, focusing on helping small businesses owned by women. Her first client had been my food blog, which had grown dramatically in the months since the trial, as people became fascinated by the chef who'd outwitted a serial poisoner. Any word from Dad? Ryan asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly hopeful. Richard had been the wild card in the aftermath of Victoria's arrest. His decades of complicity had made him a person of interest in the investigation, though ultimately no charges were filed against. The decision had been controversial, with many arguing that his passive enablement made him equally guilty of Victoria's crimes. The truth was more complicated. Richard had been as much a victim of Victoria's manipulation as anyone else, gradually worn down over the years until he'd lost the ability to recognize right from wrong in their relationship. His cooperation with the investigation had been complete, helping prosecutors understand the full scope of Victoria's network and methods. But the revelation of his cowardice had broken something fundamental in Richard's relationship with his children. He'd moved to Florida shortly after the trial, claiming he needed a fresh start away from the memories and judgment of Riverside Heights. His attempts to rebuild relationships with Ryan and Natalie had been stilted and awkward, weighed down by years of unspoken betrayal. He sent another letter. I said gently, "It's on the counter if you want to read it." Ryan shook his head. "Maybe later. I'm not ready to forgive him yet." I understood his reluctance. While Richard hadn't been the primary perpetrator, his willingness to look the other way had enabled Victoria's crimes for decades. Every victim who'd suffered could trace their pain back to his failure to act when he'd had the power to stop his wife. The kitchen timer chimed, pulling me back to the present. I was testing a new recipe for honey lavender cookies, an ironic choice given that lavender had been one of the herbs Victoria had used to mask the taste of her poison. But I'd decided not to let her crimes steal my love of ingredients she'd perverted for her own purposes. "These smell amazing," Ryan said, peering over my shoulder as I pulled the tray from the oven. "Wait until you taste them. I think I've finally got the balance right between the honey and lavender." We'd learned to find joy in simple moments like these, domestic scenes that might have seemed mundane before but now felt precious. Every shared meal, every ordinary conversation, every peaceful evening was a victory over Victoria's attempt to destroy our happiness. My phone buzzed with a text message from Detective Walsh. "Thought you'd want to know Victoria was denied her appeal. The conviction stands." I showed the message to Ryan, watching his expression carefully. The appeals process had been lengthy and emotionally draining, forcing us to relive the trauma of discovery and trial. Victoria's legal team had argued everything from ineffective counsel to prosecutorial misconduct, but each challenge had been systematically rejected. "Good," Ryan said simply. "She made her choices. Now she can live with the consequence." The finality in his voice represented months of healing and acceptance. Early in the process, he'd struggled with conflicting feelings about his mother, alternating between anger and a misplaced sense of loyalty. Therapy had helped him understand that loving someone didn't require excusing their crimes, and that protecting future victims was more important than preserving family myths. A knock at the front door interrupted my thought. Through the window I could see Amanda Patterson, Ryan's college girlfriend who'd become an unexpected ally during the trial. Her testimony about the panic attacks Victoria had induced had been crucial in establishing the pattern of systematic poisoning. "Amanda," Ryan said, opening the door with genuine warmth. "This is a surprise. I hope you don't mind me dropping by," she said, accepting his hug. "I was in town for a conference and wanted to see how you're both doing." Amanda had recovered remarkably well from her experiences with Victoria, aided by finally understanding the source of her mysterious anxiety attacks. She'd gone on to become a successful therapist specializing in trauma recovery, turning her own painful experience into a tool for helping others. "We're doing well," I said, gesturing for her to join us in the kitchen. Better than well, actually. We're happy. Amanda smiled, studying both of our faces with the professional eye of someone trained to recognize genuine emotional health. You look happy. It's wonderful to see. We spent the next hour catching up, sharing stories about our respective healing journeys, and the ways Victoria's crimes had ultimately led to positive changes in our lives. Amanda had written a book about her experience that was helping other victims of covert poisoning recognize and address their trauma. Her work had connected her with support groups around the country, creating a network of survivors who'd previously felt isolated and confused by their experience. I got a letter from Marcus last week, Amanda said, referring to Natalie's ex-boyfriend who'd suffered seizures during his relationship with her. His neurological symptoms have finally stabilized, and he's engaged to a wonderful woman who understands his medical history. That's fantastic news, Ryan said. When Natalie hears that, it'll lift a huge weight off her shoulders. Natalie had struggled with guilt about Marcus's suffering, even though she'd been as much a victim as he had been. Learning that he was building a happy life despite his ongoing health challenges would help her continue healing from her own trauma. What about the others? I asked. Have you heard from any of Victoria's other victims? Most of them are doing better, Amanda replied. Some still struggle with trust issues and health anxiety, which is understandable, but knowing what really happened to them has been liberating for many. They're not crazy, they're not weak. They were deliberately harmed by someone who should have been trustworthy. The validation aspect had been crucial for all of Victoria's victims. Years of unexplained symptoms and medical mysteries had left many of them questioning their own perceptions and mental health. Learning that their experiences had been the result of calculated poisoning campaigns had been traumatic but also oddly relieving. As Amanda prepared to leave, she turned back to us with a serious expression. I know this might be presumptuous, but I wanted to ask if you'd consider sharing your story more widely. What you did, the way you fought back and exposed her, it could help other people in similar situations. I exchanged glances with Ryan. We'd been approached by several media outlets requesting interviews, but had declined most of them, preferring to focus on our own healing rather than becoming public figures. What did you have in mind, Ryan? There's a documentary filmmaker who specializes in true crime stories with social impact. She's not interested in sensationalizing what happened, but in exploring how covert domestic abuse can go unrecognized for years. Your case could help people understand the warning signs. The idea was appealing but also daunting. Sharing our story publicly meant opening ourselves up to scrutiny and potentially reopening emotional wounds we'd worked hard to heal. Can we think about it? I asked. Of course, no pressure at all, but if you decide you're interested, I can put you in touch with her. After Amanda left, Ryan and I sat on our back porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The peaceful scene was a stark contrast to the chaos and fear that had dominated our lives during Victoria's reign of terror. Do you think we should do the documentary? Ryan asked, breaking the comfortable silence. I considered the question carefully. Part of me wants to move on completely, never think about her again, but then I remember all the people who came forward during the trial, who'd spent years thinking they were going crazy, or weak. If our story could help even one person recognize what was happening to them. Ryan trailed off, but I understood his meaning. Victoria's crimes had been possible partly because they were so difficult to recognize and prove. Covert poisoning was the perfect crime for someone with medical knowledge and patience, creating symptoms that appeared natural while maintaining plausible deniability. Maybe that's our responsibility, I said slowly, to make sure people understand that this kind of abuse exists, that it's not paranoia to question unexplained symptoms when someone has motive to harm you. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. And maybe it would help us too, turn something horrible into something useful. We spent the evening discussing the possibilities, weighing the benefits of sharing our story against the personal cost of reliving painful memories. By the time we went to bed, we'd made our decision. The documentary, titled The Perfect Family, was released 8 months later to critical acclaim and significant public attention. The filmmaker had approached our story with sensitivity and intelligence, focusing on the psychological dynamics that had enabled Victoria's crimes, rather than simply sensationalizing the dramatic detail. The film explored themes of family loyalty, the difficulty of recognizing abuse from trusted figures, and the courage required to challenge authority even when the stakes are life and death. Our interviews were interwoven with commentary from experts in toxicology, psychology, and domestic abuse, creating a comprehensive examination of how someone like Victoria could operate undetected for so long. The response was overwhelming. We received hundreds of messages from viewers who recognized similar patterns in their own lives, who'd experienced unexplained symptoms around family members or romantic partners who seemed to benefit from their illness. Several police departments reported increases in covert poisoning investigations following the documentary's release. Most importantly, the film sparked conversations about the nature of abuse and control in intimate relationships. Victoria's case became a case study in criminal justice courses and medical schools, helping train future professionals to recognize the signs of systematic poisoning. On the first anniversary of Victoria's sentencing, Ryan, Natalie, and I gathered at our new home for a quiet dinner together. We'd established this as our own tradition, a way of marking not just the end of Victoria's crimes, but the beginning of our authentic family relationships. "I have something to tell you both," Natalie said as we finished our main course. She was glowing with excitement, practically bouncing in her chair. "Let me guess," Ryan said with a grin. "You're getting married." "Better," Natalie replied. "I'm pregnant." The announcement was met with tears, hugs, and celebration. After everything we'd been through, the idea of new life and hope felt like the ultimate victory over Victoria's attempts to destroy our happiness. "Does this mean I'm going to be Uncle Ryan?" he asked, wiping tears from his eyes. "And I'm going to be Aunt Claire," I added, feeling a joy so pure it almost hurt. As we celebrated late into the evening, I reflected on how far we'd all come from that terrible Sunday when Victoria had tried to poison me. She'd intended to eliminate what she saw as a threat to her family's harmony, but instead, she'd created something stronger and more authentic than what had existed before. We were no longer bound together by obligation or fear, but by choice and genuine love. We'd seen each other at our worst and most vulnerable, and we'd chosen to fight for each other rather than retreat into comfortable lies. Victoria remained in prison, still maintaining her innocence and blaming her victims for their own suffering. According to our last update from Detective Walsh, she'd shown no signs of rehabilitation or remorse, remaining convinced that she'd been wrongfully persecuted for making necessary decisions. In a strange way, I felt sorry for her. She'd spent so much energy trying to control everything around her that she'd never learned to simply love and trust the people in her life. Her need for dominance had ultimately cost her everything she'd claimed to be protected. But that was her choice, just as our healing and happiness were ours. We couldn't change what had happened to us, but we could control how we responded to it. As I looked around our dinner table at the faces of the people I loved most in the world, I felt grateful for the strength we'd found in each other and the future we were building together. Victoria's legacy would be one of cruelty and manipulation, but ours would be about resilience, truth, and the courage to create something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. The perfect family she'd tried to maintain through fear and control had been an illusion. The imperfect but genuine family we'd built through honesty and choice was infinitely more precious. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.